The evening sun cast a warm, golden hue over the neighborhood as birds chirped their final songs of the day. It was a modest apartment complex, nestled in a quiet corner of the city, where life moved at its own unhurried pace. Most tenants kept to themselves, exchanging polite nods or brief conversations in passing. It was the kind of place where people came to start fresh or make ends meet, until Mr. Hampton, the landlord, came into the picture. Mr. Hampton was an older man with sharp, calculating eyes and an ever-present scowl etched deep into his face. He ran the complex with an iron fist, always finding reasons to hover over his tenants' lives. If someone left their trash outside for a moment too long or missed a rent payment by even a day, they would hear about it. While his strictness was off-putting to some, others whispered about his bias, how his demeanor seemed to shift depending on who he was dealing with. One particular tenant had recently caught his attention. A well-dressed young man had moved into the building 6 months ago, renting a modest unit on the 3rd floor. He was quiet, polite, and always paid his rent on time. But none of that mattered to Mr. Hampton. To him, the young man's presence was a problem. "He doesn't belong here," Hampton grumbled under his breath one day while inspecting the mailboxes. It wasn't long before Hampton started nitpicking everything about the tenant. He claimed the man was being too loud, despite complaints from no one else. He sent warning notices about fabricated issues, like imaginary water damage from a non-existent leak. The tenant never retaliated, calmly addressing each accusation with poise and evidence that proved him innocent. But Hampton wasn't deterred. If anything, the tenant's calmness seemed to infuriate him even more. One chilly morning, as the tenant stepped out of his apartment, he found Hampton waiting for him in the hallway. The landlord was leaning against the wall, holding a clipboard, his face twisted into a smug grin. "We need to talk," Hampton announced, blocking the narrow hallway. The tenant raised an eyebrow, remaining composed. About the terms of your lease. I've been reviewing it, and there are some violations," Hampton said, his voice laced with mock concern. The tenant crossed his arms and looked at Hampton squarely. "Violations? Like what?" "Well," Hampton started, flipping through his clipboard theatrically. "For starters, I've received complaints about noise coming from your apartment late at night. This isn't a club. Other tenants need peace and quiet." "That's interesting," the tenant replied calmly. "I work late most nights. I'm hardly even home during those hours." Hampton's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Be that as it may, I also noticed you've been parking in the guest spot instead of your assigned one." "I have a compact car," the tenant said, keeping his tone even. "The spot you assign me is so tight I can't open my door properly. I spoke to the other tenants, and they said they didn't mind if I used the guest spot since they rarely have visitors." Hampton's face turned red, but he held his ground. "Rules are rules, young man, and you're not following them. If this continues, I'll have no choice but to terminate your lease." The tenant didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Hampton, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said finally. "Well, if there's a formal complaint, I'd be happy to address it, but I expect any decisions about my lease to follow the law." The tension in the hallway was palpable. Hampton's grin had disappeared entirely, replaced by a scowl. "We'll see about that," he muttered before stomping off. From that day on, things escalated. Hampton increased his efforts to make the tenant's life miserable. Notices of eviction started arriving in his mailbox, each one citing bogus reasons. The building's maintenance crew mysteriously stopped fixing issues in his apartment, leaving him to deal with flickering lights and a broken heater during a cold spell. The tenant never raised his voice or showed frustration, but those around him could see the strain. Other tenants began to notice Hampton's behavior. Some whispered among themselves, questioning why he was so fixated on this one tenant. Others avoided getting involved, fearing they might become his next target. But the tenant didn't seem to be fazed. He went about his daily life as usual, smiling politely at neighbors and keeping his routine. What Hampton didn't know was that the tenant wasn't just some average young man trying to get by. Beneath his humble demeanor was a secret that would soon turn the tables on the arrogant landlord. The tenant had lived through worse challenges and had climbed his way to a life of success, a life he had chosen to keep hidden for now. One evening, after yet another baseless warning had been slipped under his door, the tenant decided it was time to act. He sat down at his small kitchen table, flipping through a leather-bound notebook filled with neatly organized notes. His phone buzzed with a message, and he smiled slightly as he read it. "It's almost time," the message said. The next day, Hampton's smug attitude was on full display as he walked through the building, clipboard in hand, preparing to serve the tenant with an official eviction notice. "This will show him," he muttered to himself. But as he approached the tenant's door, something unexpected caught his attention. Parked outside the complex was a sleek black car, polished to perfection, and clearly worth more than most of the units in the building combined. A man in a sharp suit stood nearby, talking into a headset and glancing occasionally at the building's entrance. Hampton frowned, confusion crossing his face. Who could that car belong to before he could dwell on it? The tenant stepped out of his apartment, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed a world away from his usual casual attire. He carried himself with an air of confidence that was impossible to ignore. "Morning, Mr. Hampton," the tenant said with a polite nod, his tone as calm as ever. Hampton blinked, momentarily speechless. "Morning," he managed to say, his usual bravado faltering. As the tenant walked past him, Hampton's curiosity got the better of him. "Who's that waiting outside?" he asked, gesturing toward the man by the car. "Oh, just a colleague," the tenant replied casually. "We have a meeting downtown." Hampton's eyes narrowed, but before he could probe further, the tenant added, "By the way, Mr. Hampton, I'll be sending you an email later today. There are some things we need to discuss about this property." The landlord's confusion deepened, but he forced a chuckle. "Is that so? Well, I'm sure whatever it is can wait." "Actually," the tenant said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "I think it's something you'll want to address immediately." With that, he walked out the door, leaving Hampton standing in the hallway, clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. For the first time in months, the landlord felt a pang of unease. He had no idea what was coming, but something about the tenant's demeanor told him it wouldn't be good. Outside, the tenant climbed into the sleek black car, his composed expression softening into a small smile as he greeted the driver. "It's time," he said simply. The driver nodded, pulling away from the curb as Hampton watched from the window, his scowl replaced by a look of growing uncertainty. Unbeknownst to him, the tenant had been preparing for this moment all along, and the days of Hampton's unchecked arrogance were numbered. For Hampton, it was just another day of enforcing his rules and keeping his tenants in line. But for the tenant, it was the beginning of something much bigger, a reckoning that would expose the landlord's true nature and turn the entire building's perception of him upside down. And as the sleek car disappeared into the city streets, one thing became clear. The young man wasn't just another tenant trying to survive. He was something far more formidable, and Hampton was about to learn it the hard way. The sleek black car wove through the bustling city streets as the tenant stared out of the window, his mind focused. His calm demeanor from earlier lingered, but beneath it, a quiet storm brewed. He had spent months enduring Hampton's behavior, documenting every incident, every word, and every fabricated complaint. It hadn't been easy to remain silent through it all, but now his patience was about to pay off. As the car pulled into an underground parking lot of an imposing glass building downtown, the driver gave him a nod. "You sure about this?" the man asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. The tenant smiled faintly. "Absolutely. It's time." He stepped out of the car, adjusting his tie as he entered the building. The lobby was expansive, filled with the hum of activity and the faint clicking of heels on marble floors. A receptionist greeted him warmly, calling him sir with a level of respect that hinted at his importance. He responded with the same polite charm that seemed to disarm everyone he met. Upstairs, in a corner office with sweeping views of the city, he sat at a desk that looked like it belonged to someone with a life far removed from the modest apartment complex he called home. But every detail of his appearance and surroundings was carefully curated, intentional. This was more than a home or a job. It was a stage, and every move he made had a purpose. He opened his laptop, scrolling through a series of files he had been compiling. Each document contained detailed accounts of Hampton's harassment, dates, times, photos, and even recorded conversations. He had been methodical, leaving no room for doubt or error. What started as a way to protect himself had evolved into something much larger, a chance to expose the kind of behavior that so many others might have silently endured. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath as he stared at the screen. The building's tenants didn't know his true identity, and he had taken care to keep it that way. To them, he was just another face in the hallway, another name on the mailbox. But for Hampton, he represented everything the landlord despised, everything that terrified him. And that fear was about to come to light. Back at the apartment complex, Hampton paced his small office, muttering to himself as he looked over the eviction notice he planned to deliver. Something about the tenant's demeanor that morning had unsettled him, and the sight of that car, a car worth more than his entire annual income, had gnawed at the edges of his confidence. He shook his head, dismissing the unease. "He's bluffing," he muttered, "just trying to intimidate me." But even as he said the words, they rang hollow. There was something about the tenant that didn't add up, something he couldn't quite place. Hampton had always prided himself on his ability to control the narrative, to keep his tenants in check. He had a way of making people feel small, powerless, and dependent on him. But this tenant was different. No matter what Hampton threw his way, the man never faltered. And now, for the first time in years, Hampton felt like the one who was out of control. The other tenants had started noticing too. In hushed whispers, they talked about how Hampton seemed more irritable than usual, snapping at people for minor infractions and spending more time than ever prowling the hallways. Some wondered if he was finally losing his grip, while others suspected there was something deeper going on. One tenant, a retired teacher who had lived in the building for decades, shook her head as she watched Hampton storm through the courtyard one afternoon. "He's scared of that young man," she said to a neighbor, her voice low. "You can see it in the way he looks at him. He's hiding something, and it's only a matter of time before it comes out." Meanwhile, in the tenant's apartment, the calm facade continued. He greeted neighbors with a smile, made small talk in the laundry room, and carried on as if nothing unusual was happening. But behind closed doors, he was carefully orchestrating his next move. The emails he had mentioned to Hampton earlier were part of a larger plan. He wasn't just addressing the landlord's behavior, he was exposing it to the world. With the help of his team, he had drafted detailed reports to send to local housing authorities, tenant advocacy groups, and even the media. Hampton's reputation, carefully built on years of intimidation and manipulation, was about to crumble. But the tenant wasn't stopping there. He had learned early on that change required more than just exposing wrongdoing. It required action, accountability, and a plan to ensure history didn't repeat itself. That's why he had already begun looking into purchasing the very building he lived in, a bold move that would put him in a position to protect the tenants Hampton had spent years exploiting. It wasn't just about revenge, though. The tenant had seen firsthand how people like Hampton preyed on those who couldn't fight back. Single mothers, retirees, immigrants trying to build a better life. For him, this was about justice, about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The next day, as Hampton made his rounds, he noticed something strange. The usual buzz of activity in the building had quieted, replaced by an undercurrent of tension. Tenants avoided his gaze, their whispers growing louder whenever he passed. He overheard snippets of conversations that left him uneasy, mentions of emails, meetings, and something about the truth coming out. By the time he reached his office, his nerves were frayed. He slammed the door behind him, breathing heavily as he sat down at his desk. His phone buzzed with a notification, and he glanced at the screen, his stomach sinking as he read the subject line. Urgent. Formal complaint filed against property management. He opened the email with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the contents. It was from a tenant advocacy group, outlining a series of allegations against him and the property's management practices. Attached were files containing detailed evidence, photos, audio recordings, and written statements from tenants. His face turned pale as he realized the scale of what he was up against. In his panic, he didn't notice the quiet knock on his office door until it opened slightly. The tenant stepped inside, his calm presence filling the room like a storm waiting to break. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hampton," he said, closing the door behind him. "I think it's time we had a proper conversation." Hampton stared at him, speechless, as the weight of everything he had tried to suppress came crashing down around him. Mr. Hampton's breath hitched as the tenant calmly took a seat across from him, his movements deliberate and measured. The landlord's usual confidence seemed to evaporate in the charged air of the small office. The tenant placed a folder on the desk between them and clasped his hands, his gaze steady but unreadable. "I imagine you've seen the emails by now," the tenant began, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. Hampton swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The tenant didn't flinch. He opened the folder, revealing neatly organized documents and photographs. "This is just the beginning," he said. "What you've done to me and others in this building is unacceptable, and now the truth is coming to light." Hampton leaned forward, his face flushed with anger. "Listen here, you," he started, but the tenant cut him off with a quiet but firm tone that demanded attention. "No," the tenant said, his voice sharp enough to halt Hampton mid-sentence. "You listen. I've endured months of your harassment. You've fabricated complaints, withheld essential repairs, and tried every trick in the book to push me out. But what you didn't realize is that I've been watching you just as closely as you've been watching me." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Hampton opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss. He was used to being the one in control, the one dictating the rules. But now, for the first time, he felt cornered. The tenant leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You think you can intimidate people because they don't have the resources to fight back. But you underestimated me. You didn't bother to find out who I really am, did you?" Hampton frowned, confusion flashing across his face. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, though his voice lacked the authority he intended. The tenant smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Let me make it simple for you. I'm not just another tenant scraping by to make rent. I'm someone who has the means, the knowledge, and the connections to make sure your actions are held accountable." Hampton's eyes darted to the folder, then back to the tenant. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice cracked on the final word. "Am I?" the tenant replied, raising an eyebrow. He slid one of the documents across the desk. "Take a look. That's a formal complaint filed with the Housing Authority. And this," he slid another document forward, "is a list of every instance of harassment you've subjected me to, backed by evidence." Hampton hesitated, his hands trembling as he picked up the papers. His eyes scanned the words, each line pulling him deeper into the realization of how meticulously the tenant had documented everything. "And that's not all," the tenant continued. "Do you remember the maintenance issues you ignored? The other tenants who left because of your behavior? I've spoken to them. They've shared their stories. You see, Mr. Hampton, this isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone you've mistreated." Hampton's face turned a deep shade of red as he slammed the papers back onto the desk. "You think you can just waltz in here and threaten me?" He spat. The tenant's expression didn't waver. "It's not a threat, Mr. Hampton. It's a promise. And if you think this ends with some paperwork, you're mistaken. The media is very interested in hearing about how a landlord abuses his power. Hampton's chair creaked as he leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You're trying to ruin me," he hissed. The tenant didn't deny it. "No, Mr. Hampton. You ruined yourself. I'm just holding up the mirror." The tension in the room was suffocating. Hampton's mind raced, trying to find a way out of the corner he had been backed into. He had always relied on his authority to keep people in line, but now that authority was crumbling, and he was running out of options. Finally, he smirked, though it was a weak attempt to regain some control. "You think anyone will believe you? I've been running this place for years. I have connections too, you know." The tenant tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. "That may have worked before," he said. "But times are changing, Mr. Hampton. People are tired of landlords like you taking advantage of them. And when the truth comes out, your connections won't be able to save you." Outside the office, the building buzzed with a quiet energy. Tenants whispered to one another in hallways and stairwells, their curiosity piqued by the escalating tension between Hampton and the tenant. Some had already seen the emails, while others were piecing together the clues. By the time the tenant left Hampton's office, his calm expression intact, the entire building seemed to hold its breath. Neighbors exchanged glances as he passed, sensing that something monumental was unfolding. Hampton, however, remained behind his desk, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't dealing with an ordinary tenant. This man wasn't just pushing back. He was dismantling everything Hampton had built. As the tenant returned to his apartment, his phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at the screen and smiled slightly. "Everything's in place," the message read. He set the phone down and looked around his modest apartment, the walls bare except for a few personal touches. It had never been about the money for him. This place, and the fight he was waging, represented something far more important. A stand against people like Hampton who thought they could trample over others without consequence. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. The air in the building felt charged, as if everyone was waiting for the storm to break. And deep down, even Hampton knew there was no stopping what was coming. As the tenant sat quietly in his apartment, reviewing the final details of his plan, a sudden knock at the door broke the silence. It was firm and deliberate, the kind of knock that demanded attention. He glanced toward the door, his calm exterior faltering slightly. Few people visited him here, and with the tension thick in the air, the unexpected visitor felt like a sign of something brewing. He opened the door to find a woman standing there, her expression both anxious and determined. She introduced herself as a former tenant who had lived in the building years ago. Her presence was surprising, but her next words hit like a lightning bolt. "I heard what you're doing," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "And you need to know, there's more to Hampton than you realize." The tenant stepped aside, inviting her in as curiosity flickered across his face. Once inside, she wasted no time explaining. She recounted her years in the building, describing how Hampton's harassment had driven her to leave abruptly. But it wasn't just about unpaid repairs or false accusations. She claimed Hampton had connections to a group that specialized in exploiting vulnerable tenants across the city. He wasn't just a bad landlord. He was part of a larger, more insidious network. The tenant listened carefully, piecing together the implications of her story. If what she said was true, Hampton wasn't acting alone. His confidence and arrogance might have stemmed from knowing he had powerful allies who would protect him if things went wrong. It also explained why so many complaints about him had seemingly disappeared over the years, swept under the rug without a trace. The revelation deepened the stakes. What had initially seemed like a battle against one corrupt landlord now felt like the beginning of something much bigger. The tenant's focus sharpened. He had planned to expose Hampton, but now he realized this was about more than just holding one man accountable. This was about dismantling an entire system of exploitation. He asked the woman if she had evidence to back up her claims. She hesitated, glancing around the room as if weighing her decision. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of papers. "This is what I've kept over the years," she said. "Letters, emails, and even photos. I was too scared to use them before, but if you're going after Hampton, I want to help." As he flipped through the documents, the tenant felt a surge of resolve. The evidence was damning, painting a clear picture of how Hampton and his associates had targeted tenants, manipulated housing policies, and evaded consequences. This wasn't just about greed, it was about power. But just as the pieces began falling into place, the tenant's phone buzzed with a call. It was one of his associates, someone who had been helping him compile evidence against Hampton. The voice on the other end was tense. "We've got a problem," they said. "It looks like Hampton knows more than we thought. He's already started contacting people to cover his tracks." The tenant's jaw tightened. Hampton was scrambling, and desperate people often made reckless decisions. The game was shifting, and he needed to stay one step ahead. He thanked the woman for her bravery and promised her that her story, and her evidence, would play a crucial role in what was to come. She left with a look of hope mixed with trepidation, knowing she had entrusted her past to someone she believed could make a difference. Meanwhile, across the building, Hampton was on the phone, his voice low but frantic. "You said this wouldn't happen," he hissed. "I've been following the plan, and now everything's falling apart. You need to fix this." Wover was on the other end of the call, responded sharply, their words inaudible through the walls. Hampton's face twisted with frustration as he slammed the phone down. He didn't realize he was no longer in control, not of the situation, not of the narrative, and certainly not of the tenant he had underestimated. The next morning, the tenant received another unexpected message, this time from a local journalist. They had caught wind of the story and were eager to run an expose on Hampton. While the attention was welcome, it also meant the clock was ticking. If the story went public before all the pieces were in place, it could jeopardize everything. As he navigated the day, the tenant felt the weight of the growing stakes. Hampton wasn't just a man trying to protect his reputation. He was a man with secrets, alliances, and enough desperation to try anything. And now, with more people involved and the web of corruption coming to light, the tenant knew he was walking a fine line. The tension in the building was palpable. Tenants whispered in the hallways, speculating about what was happening. Hampton's behavior grew increasingly erratic, and his attempts to maintain control only seemed to add fuel to the fire. The tenant, however, remained focused, knowing the real storm was yet to come. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than anyone expected. The tenant stood at the front of the building's community hall, a quiet yet commanding presence. The room was filled with tenants, some curious, others anxious, but all determined to learn the truth. They had been invited by the tenant himself, who promised to reveal everything. Even Hampton had reluctantly shown up, his expression a mask of forced confidence. He leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, trying to appear unfazed. The tenant began by recounting his experiences in the building, how he had faced endless harassment, unjust demands, and countless attempts to drive him out. He spoke plainly, his words resonating with the crowd. As he spoke, he displayed evidence on a screen behind him. Photos of disrepair Hampton had ignored, emails threatening eviction, and complaints filed by other tenants over the years. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment. Tenants exchanged uneasy glances as they recognized their own stories in his words. Hampton's smirk began to fade, replaced by a flicker of unease. He could no longer dismiss the tenant's claims as baseless or exaggerated. This was a carefully built case, and it was airtight. Then the tenant took a deep breath and said, "But this isn't just about one landlord." He gestured to a stack of papers beside him. "Over the past few months, I've uncovered evidence that points to something much bigger. Hampton isn't acting alone. He's part of a network of landlords who profit by exploiting tenants like us." A collective gasp swept through the room. Hampton's face turned pale as the tenant pulled out document after document, showing correspondence between Hampton and others in his circle. They had shared strategies, covered for one another, and worked together to ensure their practices went unchecked. The tenant paused and looked directly at Hampton. "You thought you could intimidate me. You thought you could silence me, but you never bothered to find out who I am." Hampton's voice cracked as he blurted out, "You think you're some kind of hero. You're just a troublemaker trying to ruin people's lives." The tenant calmly replied, "No, Mr. Hampton. I'm someone who believes in justice, and unlike you, I have the resources to make it happen." He stepped forward, his voice firm but steady. "I'm not just your tenant. I'm a legal consultant and an investor, and I've already partnered with organizations that are committed to protecting tenants' rights." The room erupted in murmurs. Hampton's facade crumbled entirely as he realized the man he had tried to bully was not only prepared, but had the power to take him down. Before Hampton could respond, the doors to the hall opened, and several people entered, including journalists, housing authority officials, and even a few police officers. The tenant had arranged for them to witness the moment firsthand. Hampton's voice trembled as he stammered, You can't do this. You have no right." The tenant simply nodded toward the officials. One of them stepped forward, holding out a document. "Mr. Hampton, this is a warrant for a full investigation into your practices, as well as the practices of those you've been in contact with." Hampton's world seemed to collapse around him. He shouted, protested, and tried to shift the blame, but it was clear his words held no weight. The tenants watched as the man who had terrorized them for years was finally held accountable. But just as the tension began to lift, a final twist emerged. One of the journalists pulled the tenant aside and whispered, "There's something you need to see." She handed him a file she had been working on, one that connected the landlord network to a larger chain of real estate firms across the city. The tenant's eyes widened as he scanned the contents. The network wasn't just exploiting tenants in one building or even a few. It was a citywide operation, siphoning millions from vulnerable renters while hiding behind layers of bureaucracy. He turned back to the crowd and raised his voice. "This isn't over," he said. "Today, we've taken the first step, but there's still so much work to do." The room erupted into applause, the tenants cheering for the man who had stood up for them when no one else would. Hampton was escorted out, his protests fading into the background. As the tenant walked out of the hall, the journalist caught up with him. "What's your next move?" she asked. He smiled faintly, his determination shining through. "Expose the whole system," he said, "and make sure no one else has to go through this again." The story wasn't over, but a new chapter had begun, a fight not just for justice, but for change on a scale no one had expected. And for the first time, the tenants of the building felt hope, knowing they had someone willing to stand with them every step of the way. In the weeks that followed the meeting in the community hall, the building felt like a completely different place. The tenants, once isolated and wary of one another, began to come together in ways they hadn't before. It wasn't just about Hampton anymore. It was about taking control of their living situation and ensuring that no one else would suffer in silence. The tenant who had exposed Hampton became something of a local hero. People would stop him in the hallway to thank him for standing up when they felt they couldn't. Some of the older tenants shared their own stories, recounting years of intimidation and neglect. Younger tenants, inspired by his courage, volunteered to help collect information about other landlords in the area. What had started as one man's battle had become a community-wide movement. The investigation into Hampton and his network unfolded swiftly. Authorities uncovered layers of corruption that extended far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Bank records, falsified documents, and secret communications revealed how the landlords had operated in unison, exploiting tenants and evading accountability. Several key figures were arrested, and the case made headlines, sparking a citywide conversation about tenant rights and housing reform. For Hampton, the fall was swift and brutal. He lost the building, his reputation was destroyed, and his remaining allies quickly distanced themselves, hoping to avoid scrutiny. Seeing him face the consequences was a moment of vindication for the tenants, but the tenant who had led the charge didn't dwell on Hampton's downfall. His focus remained on what came next. One morning, the tenant called another meeting in the community hall. This time, the mood was lighter, almost celebratory. He shared updates on the investigation and the progress being made to ensure the building would be managed by a fair and ethical property company moving forward. He encouraged everyone to stay vigilant and informed, reminding them that their voices mattered and that they had the power to make a difference. After the meeting, he found himself talking with the woman who had come forward with evidence against Hampton. She looked more at ease than when they had first met, her relief evident. "I never thought anyone would listen," she admitted. "It feels good to know we've finally been heard." He nodded, appreciating the weight of her words. "It's not just about one victory," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen again, to anyone." The journalist who had been following the story published an in-depth exposé, highlighting the tenants' efforts and the systemic issues that had allowed landlords like Hampton to thrive. The story gained traction, leading to public pressure on city officials to implement stricter housing regulations. Advocacy groups joined the fight, organizing workshops and campaigns to educate renters about their rights. For the tenant, life began to settle into a new rhythm. He continued his work as a legal consultant, using his expertise to help others in similar situations. His story became a rallying cry for tenants across the city, inspiring others to stand up against exploitation and demand better conditions. One afternoon, as he walked through the building's courtyard, he noticed children playing and neighbors chatting, scenes of life and connection that had been absent for so long. It was a reminder of what they had all fought for, not just justice, but a sense of community and belonging. But even as the dust settled, there was one final surprise. A letter arrived in the tenant's mailbox, handwritten and unsigned. It contained a simple message: "You've started something bigger than you know. Keep going." Along with the note was a small donation, intended to support his efforts in advocating for tenant rights. The tenant smiled as he read the letter. It was a reminder that change didn't happen overnight and that the fight for fairness and equity was ongoing. But it was also proof that their efforts were making a difference, inspiring others to join the cause and continue pushing for progress. As the sun set over the building that evening, the tenant stood by his window, looking out at the city he had grown to love. He thought about the journey he had been on, the challenges he had faced, and the people who had stood by him. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And in that quiet moment, he felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that his story wasn't just his own, it was part of something much greater. The building's tenants now had hope. The city was beginning to change, and the tenant who had once been underestimated had proven that one person could indeed make a difference. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. And as he turned away from the window, ready to take on whatever came next, he knew that the story was far from ending. It was just the beginning of a new chapter.